So, hi, and welcome to the second episode of SOAS Book Chat. And today we have with us author and former journalist Avinash Paliwal, whose recent book, India's Near East, A New History, has just come out, and it is getting a lot of very good reviews. In fact, we have carried an extract from the book in the current issue of SOAS, and congratulations on a wonderful book.
Thank you so much, Ghazala. That's very kind of you to have me here and also to carry an excerpt of the book in SOAS magazine. That's deeply appreciated.
And thank you for agreeing to do this interview with us. And I'll start with the very beginning, and that is, why do you call it a new history?
Thank you. See, when I started this project, the idea was to look at India's East, look at India's relations with its neighbor, Myanmar. Primarily, that's how it began. My academic journey was first focused on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and how had India dealt with the wars in Afghanistan. And I realized when I entered the field of India's eastern kind of, geographies and demographies, that just focusing on India, Myanmar bilateral, for example, is not going to be sufficient to actually understand or give something of value to anyone who's reading this kind of a work, which is new in that sense. So new in the sense both analytically new, but also empirically new, just new knowledge, right?
Okay.
And that's where the idea came that, look, to understand the complexities of this region, and one of the things which I have found daunting was everyone used to tell me how complex this region is, right? Whether it's the far eastern states of India, the northeast, or Myanmar in particular, because it's really a melange of different communities who are interacting with each other. So I thought that, look, it has to be understood in totality. Of course, they're partitioned. Of course, these are new states, but you need to understand the interconnections and the historical interconnection, because without that, and there are silos that get created, epistemic silos, knowledge silos, policy silos for that matter, right? And that is what really triggered my interest in the wider region. And it was a difficult decision to call it the Near East. I've done it carefully without any colonial connotations around that or any kind of sociological connotations, just an analytical category. But that's why I call it a new history. This region has never been studied, Ghazala, in its totality. It's never been given the respect, the intellectual respect it deserves. I believe. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not to go against a lot of really celebrated and valued scholars and the scholarship they have produced, be it on northeast of India, be it on Bangladesh and Myanmar. But these literatures never really kind of interacted with each other, right? They were separated. They existed, but never spoke with each other. That's why I call it a new history. It really brings into bear a new analytical lens and also a lot of information, simply just the story, as they say, as a journalist would say, the story. Just stories which were not known as widely, at least.
Right. Given what is happening in Manipur today, one very obvious conclusion that one can draw, and maybe it is correct to a very large extent, it's that there has been a lot of missteps and misunderstanding of the problem by the Modi government. But then that takes away from the historical mistakes that independent India had made in this region, and not just Manipur, because it's not just a problem of Manipur. There are so many stakeholders there. And because there are so many stakeholders, there has been proliferation of small arms in the entire region, which probably contributed to ethnic disgruntlement in the region. Let's face it, this is one of the most diverse part of India. There are so many ethnic groups and maybe few resources. So there's constant tussle or scramble for those resources. And maybe that has been one of the reasons for xenophobia in this area. So when we look at what is happening in Manipur, how do you see this problem? Is it only policy failure, or there's also an element from the mainland India of prejudice, of suspicion of this region?
So thank you for that, Ghazala. Look, there is certain, I mean, there is no two ways. Just speaking of Manipur post May 2023, I mean, there is no doubt that this is whatever policy has been formulated, whatever approach has been, whatever response
Yes.
Delhi or Imphal has had towards that crisis has failed. The conflict is not going. In fact, we are seeing it play out in different shapes and forms, drones, armed drones, and still, again, the southern parts of Manipur and Imphal Valley are still, I call it, partitioned, right? There is literally a security cordon which is keeping communities apart, right? So there is that element of failure is absolutely undeniable. But you're absolutely right that, look, to say that this is a region which the BJP has failed uniquely would be an inaccuracy. There are longer historical kind of torrents to why certain policy measures have been taken, whether it's in Assam or Manipur or Nagaland or elsewhere, right? And I would say that, look, Congress struggled quite a lot in building a contract between the state and the citizenry, and a citizenry which was opposed to the ideas of India, so to say, whether constitutionally girded or otherwise, which were on offer, right? Quite strongly at times, quite violently at times. I mean, the Naga movement began right at independence, became violent by the mid to late 1950s. And then Congress was in power, and they did, they took decisions which fueled those fires rather than bring people to the table and accommodate some of the views. They tried again, also I would say the BJP is also trying in some senses behind the scenes also to do some stitching of communities and bring some degree of harmony at least. But it's a very, very sort of, polarized region already, both Manipur today and the Assam of that time, 1940s and 50s. Instead of saying, that this is about suspicion and prejudice, all of which plays a role to a certain degree, let's be honest about that, right? The two handles which I would put to it is one, very deep-seated insecurity of the state of India, regardless of which party is in power at the center. Yeah, this is a region which has had a very sort of a different engagement with authority, state, whether it was the colonial state or the post-colonial state. And that has made New Delhi, since 1947, very anxious about this region. They feel that there is, the citizenry is not always been very supportive of the idea of India. And of course, external powers like Pakistan or China have exploited that. And that is combined, I would say, in more recent decades with a degree of hubris. And I think we undervalue how much the aspirational or hubristic approach towards these regions often kind of create traps, policy traps, leading to the failures that we are seeing in Manipur. And then this whole idea of looking east and acting east. I mean, they have created a perception, public perception, let's say New Delhi, in those ecosystems, if not the country writ large, where people think that, this is, these issues are over. These issues are settled for good. Northeast, I remember just a couple of years ago, before Manipur went the way it did, India was moving armed forces, Assam Rifles and other units out of that region as a part of redeployment patterns to the China border for good reason. And there was an understanding that, look, fine, Kashmir is a complicated case still, but China border has become really kind of live post the Galwan clash. And Northeast is somewhere we have more or less, the accord is still to be signed with the Nagas. Things are relatively okay in a long historical canvas. And that came to a knot very quickly post May 2023. So I would say the mix between insecurities or status anxieties and hubris, policy hubris, let's say, that is what has caused this constant tension, which is not going away, unfortunately.
Something else also occurs to me. We talk about diversity of India, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, or we were talking earlier, Northeast is a hugely diverse region, and not only in terms of religion, but also in terms of ethnicities, and which ethnicity came to this part of the world in which period. So all of that has shaped their relationship with the mainland, and as well as with one another. So given this, is there a thrust towards uniformity in this region? You see what is happening in Assam now. that there is denial of diversity, and there is some sort of a top-down enforcement of uniformity. You think this is also creating a lot of bad blood in this region?
It's, again, as you note, it's a very diverse region. And look, diversity in itself is neither here nor there, Ghazala, right? Just because there's a different communities does not mean they're condemned to conflict and enmity at a social level or social strife, or they are kind of necessarily going to witness social harmony for that matter, just because even if, let's assume, even if it was a richer, relatively richer area, right, well endowed economically, which India's northeastern states unfortunately are not. But even if that were the case, I think there would have been, the risk of strife always remains in that, if identity politics becomes potent. Any idea of imposing unity or uniformity, as you call it, is likely to run against a lot of historical and contemporary grievances. And we have seen that play out in we are seeing it play out in Manipur right now. We do know that this is something that will have kind of ricochets, maybe if not now, later in Assam. We have seen in Bangladesh, for example, right? Everyone assumed that the Citizenship Amendments Act in 2020 in India would, there was a bit of annoyance and some statements from then Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, but it was assumed that the neighborhood would accept it as fait accompli. And today you can see the anger that is playing out in the Bangladeshi street. Now, there are many different causes for that. I don't want this to make
I'll come to that. I'll come back.
Yeah, but this drive, especially if it's a uniform, if the drive is to bring in uniformity using a certain identity marker. If you try to homogenize some very diverse area based on a particular idea of what, whether it's religious ideas of uniformity, whether it's other ideas of uniformity, that will invariably lead to pushback. And that's one reason why even in the book I mentioned that, the idea of the Constitution of India, it's a contested idea. The Constitution is not kind of gospel, right? But it offers a platform for negotiation between the state and the citizen, most importantly. People who are otherwise part of minority communities or feel disenfranchised can use the Constitution to feel empowered legally and judicially as a citizen, right? And that is something which is very central. And this is a region, India's Near East, which has shown time and again the value of that document. And I can give that example, so can you, about different parts of the country. But this is where really the Constitution has been, tested time and again till today, for that matter.
That's true. We moved from look east to act east, but any policy which talks about action has to willy-nilly be, the fulcrum has to be seamless connectivity. There was this ambitious trilateral in India, Myanmar, Thailand. It remains work in progress, primarily on the Indian side. Now we are we have suspended the free movement regime in Myanmar, which had open borders with, in FMR in Manipur, which had open borders with Myanmar. So in this kind of a situation where we are hardening our borders, what kind of connectivity, regional connectivity, can we talk about? Isn't there a contradiction here?
There is. There is a contradiction in some way, the way you phrase it, but there is not a contradiction, and let me come to that as well.
Right.
Now, the contradiction is that, look, these are partitioned lands, Ghazala, right? The partition of Pakistan and India, the separation of Burma from India in 1937, that has really scarred communities, and we can still see the impact of that, right? The debate around fencing the India-Myanmar border, the legacies go back all the way to 1930s. This is not a new debate. Over the decades, the debate has come in different shapes and forms and remains to be the case till 2024 and likely to be moving forward. The idea of connectivity is it is to obviate not the partition or the international boundaries, to disrespect boundaries, but to obviate the disruption that partitions caused, the economic disruption in particular, right? There was a recognition that these are communities which have politically separated from each other. You cannot undo those separations, right? Those partitions. Bangladesh or East Pakistan was not going to reunite in that sense with India, or Burma with India for that matter. But you can try to undo the economic partitions that it caused. And there is a huge disruption that the creation of East Pakistan caused in one of the most important kind of global industry at that point in time, which was the jute and the cotton industries, right?
Yes.
It completely wrecked the economy of Bengal, completely. Rangoon used to be a very important port during the 1950s, mostly run by people of Indian heritage, which brought its own problems there. But that economic story went down the drain because of these partitions, and the connectivity is to obviate that till today. And it remains, as you said, a work in progress. But the reason why I would say that, I don't see this as a contradiction is because hard borders also feed into what we know as monitoring of that trade by people in power. And one of the best sources of connectivity, and which is unfortunate, that India has with its neighborhood in this part, Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Bangladesh. I mean, Bangladesh, there's a lot of formal connectivity, but with Myanmar, it's all illegal connectivity. Drug trade is one of the most flourishing trades in the region. And when you start having those, and that creates certain logics, that creates certain interests, which find segue into the electoral politics of India, into the electoral politics of Bangladesh and elsewhere. So I think if we change the lens of how we understand connectivity, a lot more will start to make sense. If we start looking at connectivities desired by certain groups to remain in the underground, rather than be formalized the way we have seen in Europe, for example, then the hard border is actually very necessary. And then, it's good to have that trilateral highway that you were mentioning with Thailand. But even if it does not work, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. There's a lot of maritime connectivity as well to Southeast Asia. So I see it with a very different lens while, over the course of the research of this book. There are different meanings to connectivity depending on who you're talking to.
Maritime border is official border. It's or maritime trade is basically between a nation and another nation. But when we talk of land borders and when we talk of soft land borders, then we are also talking about fostering those human contact between regions which has divided families. I mean, you were referring to partition and 71, the way the border ran. In the same village, half the village was on one side of the border and other was on another side. So if we have hard borders here, and if there is hardening of positions on both sides of the border, immediately on the both sides of the border, can bilateral relations only be sustained by government outreach?
No, and we have seen the limits of government to government outreach. In fact, Bangladesh is a classic case in point, even Myanmar for that matter, right? India is focused primarily on the junta. In Naypyidaw still does. There is a reason for that, and I understand that. But these two cases also show the disconnect, a very deep disconnect at the level of just people. The fact that people in Bangladesh have such angst against the government of India, at least, if not people of India, and that the people in India, the audiences in India, are struggling to understand why is it that Chief Advisor Mohammed Yunus in Dhaka is saying that, Indian concerns about minority rights in Bangladesh are exaggerated. You can see these are two countries which were having conversations at cross purposes. Same in Myanmar, where people say that India needs to engage with much more fruitfully, perhaps, and much more in an expansive manner with the so-called, the resistance or the national unity government, which is resisting the junta. And the junta is struggling quite strongly, whereas India has officially, at least, kind of reached out primarily to the junta over the past 3 years when the coup happened in 2021. That shows very clearly, Ghazala, the limits of government to government. This is just not sustainable, not in a region which is so deeply connected at a social level. So you're right. I see where you're coming from, that hard borders in that sense do not sustain. But again, these are, as I said earlier, insecurities of a state. And those insecurities are shared both by India, by Bangladesh and Myanmar. And the governments in these three countries are pretty okay with hard borders to a certain extent, or monitored borders, right? But can that kind of, should that not, how to deal with people-to-people connectivity is something that they still need to think about in a different manner. And I don't personally think that, look, just softening of the borders would necessarily lead to that. We need
Okay.
a larger conversation between publics. I think just having a hard border itself, in my personal view, is not the problem. If you can foster happy kind of platforms for people to connect with each other, to understand each other, for media organizations from all these countries to actually work together and understand each other's perspectives better in a much more healthier environment, then that hard border is, even however hard it may be, will be of very, very limited consequence in that sense. So I think that is a symptom rather than the cause of anything. And those causes will have to be addressed in a long-term sense, and that's a struggle.
Right. Your answer leads to another interesting conversation now, and that is the attention that media pays. You think there is a disproportionate disconnect in the Indian media towards India's Near East? We hardly have any reportage unless it's bad news coming from there. Our media's attention is a little too much to the West rather than the East. So what is the reason for that? Is the Indian mainland completely disconnected with the East? Do we regard that Bangladesh is, it's a bordering nation to West Bengal instead of a bordering country for India? I mean, is this how we see our Near East?
See, there are two parts to this question as I see this, Ghazala. First thing is Indian media as a beast in itself, right? And there are, see, it's a sector, it's an industry which has been struggling for various reasons, be it political, be it systemic, be it how you do the business, how not the business, how do you do good journalism, and there are a lot of really good journalists in India. This is not a comment on journalists per se, but they're also kind of working in a very unforgiving space.
Yeah.
And that is something which is not lost on anyone who honestly looks at the situation in the media situation in India. And that creates certain dynamics, at least in that sector, to respond to certain preconceived demand by what they see as their core audiences. And that invariably goes towards either kind of really kind of yellow journalism, or goes in the direction of, when it comes to geopolitics, more big, today US-China issue, perhaps to a certain extent, Pakistan, almost always Kashmir. In that kind of, prioritization calculus, India's Near East has never figured at even the mid-ranking level. It has been somewhere below in that sense of the term, and which is unfortunate, which is just also national reality. India's policy making is also much more geared towards China and Pakistan than towards Bangladesh and Myanmar. I mean, it's not just a media concern. But yes, coming to the second issue of focusing on this region particularly, I do think that this speaks to the larger disconnect that I was mentioning earlier. It's, disconnect is not just about the border, whether you have a hard border or a soft border. It's about who is actually interested. And the number of the clutch of scholars and journalists working from India, not just Delhi, anywhere. Some of them are doing great work, but they're also that's the cohort is very limited. And that's again the nature of how knowledge is being created around these questions in India. And that's why you see such a huge kind of cross conversation that is happening between the interim government in Dhaka and New Delhi, and not just between governments, but also between how the Indian media has reported the situation in Bangladesh, and how Bangladeshis wanted to be reported in that sense of the term.
Yes.
So yes, it's a systemic problem. I do hope moving forward that it will be addressed. I do hope. I mean, I remember when I recently published this book, someone from the Indian government, who said that you're the first kind of. I'm born and brought up in Delhi. Now I'm in London, but that I'm the first kind of, quote unquote, someone from the mainland, as they say, who has written about that region. And I found that both, it is sad in some senses, even though kind of I felt honored that, okay, fine, at least you're recognizing that But it was also very sad, a comment to face, but it's true.
What were the big revelations for you when you were researching for this book?
Oh, so much. This book took me 6 years to write, first of all. A lot of research in the archives, multi-sited archives, and a lot of interviews with different kind of individuals across the board. I think I learned a lot. The biggest revelation was around the 1971 war. It has completely changed the way I have looked at India practicing power in that particular part. There are a lot many layers to what India did before 1971 that we appreciate. The security agencies, the security establishment in India around 1965, when the 1965 war happens, that's when a consensus had emerged in Delhi that a solution has to be found in the Near East to this 2.5 front kind of security dilemma. And they started putting measures in place for that to happen. Now, no one can foresee these things with accuracy. No one, no intelligence agency can say, okay, we're going to go to war. But if you start putting pressure on the right pressure points in a neighboring or as they're considered, adversarial country, adversarial neighbor, then you can create chain reactions. And that was something which has been a huge revelation. India, or sections of India's security establishment, wanted to dismember Pakistan long before the Operation Searchlight was launched in March, 25th of March 1971, long before the genocide kind of happens. There was a commitment towards pushing East Pakistan into a separate direction. That debate happened till the last moment between diplomats and perhaps spooks and officials, security officials, but there was very clearly an intent to do that. That was a very, very big revelation in terms of what did they do. The other revelation was 2 or 3 revelations. I'll quickly finish with those 3. That India actually armed the Burma army in 1949 to prevent the collapse of the Burmese state as we know it till today. And it worked. The Intelligence Bureau of India worked with the Pakistani ISI to make that happen.
Yes,
Indians and Pakistanis were working together, which is surreal. You've just fought a war in Kashmir. You're working together to prevent a communist and Karen nationalist onslaught in neighboring Burma. Of course, the British played a huge role at that time because they were still a very kind of paramount power in some senses. And lastly, which is much more closer to time, is 2009, the Bangladesh Rifles mutiny. That was an episode that really took me off guard because, as someone who's working on these issues, talking to people, you hear all sorts of myths and all sorts of narratives, and you have to take them with a handful of salt. But here is a case where India did almost intervene militarily in Bangladesh, and it was not a bluff. They had prepared a 1,500 odd kind of strong spearhead of the paratroopers, Indian paratroopers, special forces, from Agra. They had been airlifted to all 3 sides of the Bangladesh border, and they were good to go. They had opened up all the first line ammunition. The green light also came at some point, but was resigned at last second. They were good to go, and India threatened the Bangladeshi army at that time that if you do not go by what then Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was saying of how to deal with the crisis, Indian paratroopers will be in Dhaka within 1 hour. That was a credible threat. So suddenly you start looking at the same region, the same country, in a very, very different light, and that also gives you some degree of, you start appreciating the narratives and the anxieties that India's smaller neighbors have with New Delhi. It's easy to rubbish them as paranoias, but they're also coming from somewhere, and they have to be respected. And perhaps the best times India has had with its neighbors is when it has accepted its own power, its own dominance of the region, but also respected those anxieties and tried to a certain extent to address them.
Which period was that be?
I would say that, it was 90s, certainly. It's very easy to criticize former Prime Minister in I.K. Gujral for even Rao, I would say, Narasimha Rao. Narasimha Rao really kind of wanted to tether, to restrain. There was this restraining element that he kind of went back to, which he felt that during Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi's tenure took a whole different color. I would also say, during the Nehruvian era, there was a degree of maturity in terms of, again, Nehru was, I don't have a very roseate view of Nehru. I think a lot of the problems we see today go back to the Nehruvian period. So there are some serious complications there. I don't pedestalize in that sense Jawaharlal Nehru. But there was a degree of conservatism which helped keep tensions under the surface, right? I would say also, to an extent, both Mr. Vajpayee, Mr. Manmohan Singh tried to use those approaches. But again, the record is, that does not mean that they always succeeded. But there's something to be said when people in different parts of India's neighborhood come and respect Atal Bihari Vajpayee for being a statesman, or for being someone who could have delivered what they think they desire from India as a big neighbor to deliver. And that's something to recognize when we are dealing with neighbors, right? That's not something which is to be undervalued just because it would come across, usually the criticism is India is a soft state if it is not doing some aggressive action. But if you look at diplomacy and how it actually plays out, it takes a lot more to restrain than to actually be aggressive. So I do think that is perhaps, again, it's not a silver bullet, but perhaps a much more stable, enduring formula.
Right. Finally, you have mentioned that the present regime's focus on Hindutva has to a large extent shaped its relationship with Myanmar. Now, why should that be a problem, considering India, for all practical purposes, is more or less a Hindu country? And other nations, also big nations, have used religion as part of their foreign policy outreach in their not only neighborhood, but even in the distant neighborhood. So if India's foreign policy is shaped by its religious predilections, what is wrong in that?
So again, I don't put value judgments as an analyst, Ghazala. I mean, this is for India to choose, right? If you want religion to play an important role in your foreign policy, especially in your neighborhood, if not writ large, that's a choice for you to make. The only risks, and I think, let me get you mentioned Myanmar, so I'll come to it for a second, is, the only risk is that, not every country will accept that kind of an outreach with equal grace. In the case of Myanmar, the idea of using that religious connectivity is actually a lot more, it has deeper roots, right? The idea of Buddhism, the fact that a lot of people in Myanmar want to visit Bodh Gaya because of their Buddhist, because they practice. It is the most natural thing to do. There's absolutely no problem in that. There are many Hindu communities and Muslim communities, Indian Muslim communities, which have also lived in Burma for generations, really. I mean, a lot of them were kicked out during the 50s, 60s, and some after. But many of them are still there, right? And they practice their religions as they like in some senses. The concern is when it becomes so politicized and your policy choices on some of the core crises in the region starts getting shaped by that. That's when this whole plank of using kind of a religious sort of glue, so to say, between two countries starts to create offsets or other sorts of course. And the classic case is the Rohingya crisis, right? Now, again, there's a longer history. India has always seen the Rohingya crisis during the Congress era also, with the huge dollop of suspicion. The meeting of minds and how that crisis was seen by Naypyidaw Rangoon earlier and New Delhi, it has deeper histories than just Hindutva or Buddhist, Burma Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar. More recently, we saw that play out in domestic setting in India. Whether it's Rohingya community in Jammu, in Hyderabad, Delhi, and very kind of powerful sort of anti-Rohingya sentiment, of course, in Myanmar, both in kind of Naypyidaw, but also
and it's an important issue during elections also. For instance, speech by the Prime Minister in Jharkhand.
So exactly. So you can see these issues finding domestic electoral resonance, right? For good or bad is not something for me to say, but they're finding, and that creates risks. And that creates risks. You can see that, for example, it was a tough conversation around 2017-18 to be had with Sheikh Hasina when the crisis and the mass exodus was happening of Rohingyas. India was broadly seen as taking Myanmar's side by Dhaka then. And here is Dhaka, who's an ally, allegedly,
Yeah.
right? And you can see today when Chief Advisor Yunus comes and says that he is very invested in protecting the well-being of the Rohingya community in Bangladesh already. This could, moving forward, become another diplomatic issue, so point, for example, not just between Bangladesh and Myanmar, but also between Bangladesh and India, right?
Yeah.
So that is where my caution comes in, that look, you can always use religion as you wish, but it's valuable to kind of be aware that it creates, it will create second order effects which are beyond your control. And we can see that again play out in Manipur, for example.
Yeah.
There is the Zokuki communities, one of the core demands is not, there's no separatism being asked today. They are basically saying that this is almost a majoritarian onslaught, right? Even in that localized setting. So that is something to be very aware of and to be very cautious. And perhaps that's why previous governments restrained from using majoritarian planks to practice policy, whether domestically or externally. So yeah, that's what my view is on this.
Thank you so much for joining me today, and all the best.
Thank you, Ghazala.